Hello everybody, I am Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming, and I want to talk about a concept of storytelling today, and how it relates to Final Fantasy XIV. Let's talk about character death. Especially for long-term stories, character death is a tool in the toolbox that can make or break a story. I think we all know stories, games, movies out there that will just kill off characters willy-nilly, to where they don't get enough investment, or by nature of killing all the really interesting characters, we're just left with a bunch of characters that are bland and bleh. Has a story ever killed off a character for you, and because they killed that character, your enjoyment of the product rapidly declined because they had no one else to really fulfill that role? No one that was as entertaining as the character they had just killed off. And that can be really important for certain stories to do, but it's really hard to do it well and to do it effectively. A lot of times, character death can feel as if it's nothing more than cheap fodder to elicit an emotional response from the audience. And I personally think character death is at its best when it's furthering the story, when it's trying to further character development either for other characters or as an interesting capstone to that character's own arc. Not just because their story's finished, so we now gotta kill them. No. But when death is utilized in a very interesting way, I tend to find it can really elevate the story. And I think Final Fantasy XIV historically has been a series and a game that has used character death to great effect, but has used the illusion of character death as well for a lot of cop-out moments. So let's talk about it. Full spoilers for Final Fantasy XIV going forward. I've noticed a little bit of sentiment that there hasn't been too much main character death in Final Fantasy XIV all too recently, like within the last few expansions, and kinda, I think it's mainly because none of the Scions have really died since Stormblood. But it's not like Final Fantasy XIV doesn't kill some characters. Heck, we got a body count in Dawntrail as well, but I think it's a matter of how important that character was and how much we actually cared about that individual character that can really make that death memorable or kind of forgettable. And a lot of the deaths in, say, Dawntrail for me were rather forgettable because they were new characters that didn't have all that much development, but they mattered a great deal to certain characters like, say, Walkthroughs. But because I, as the player, didn't particularly care about them, the death didn't do much for me. So Dawntrail can feel to me like a story with little character death because the characters that died were characters I didn't particularly care about. And this is one of the interesting little nuances of storytelling because the way we react, the way we absorb stories differs from person to person, so there may be another person out there who got really caught up in the moment about certain characters dying, especially if they were really interested and invested in the narrative going on. I think Dawntrail had three major notable deaths, if you will. You had Gulool Ja Ja, you had Gulool Ja Ja, and then you had the Endless, including Sphene. One of the bigger deaths of Dawntrail especially was Gulool Ja Ja. It was a massive turning point in the narrative. It significantly augmented the narrative of Walkthroughs, changed his story direction and an overall character arc, was used as a focus point to really drive home the villainy Gulool Ja Ja had fully embraced willingly, and marked a massive turning point for Tyrell on the whole. So why didn't I like this death? Because from the sounds of it at least, it hits all the boxes of what I was talking about earlier in regards to good use of character death. Well, there's another element we should probably talk about, and that is how you actually end up killing the character. Do you want to have them die in a heroic sacrifice? Do you want them to die in a tragic way, like Gulool Ja did, where he died to his own son? There's many ways to end up killing a character, like disease, or just act of God, whatever. But I tend to find, and this could be a personal thing for me, and it probably is, but when a character dies because of incompetence, or just an illogical series of events that happened, I tend to focus more so on that element than the death itself, and I think that's the case with Gulool Ja Ja. Now, that's not always a bad thing if the story's really leaning into those elements, but for Gulool Ja Ja, he died in this 1v1 duel against the guy trying to wipe out all of Tyrell, and all the Scions and the Warrior of Light and Walkthroughs and Kono just standing around watching it happen. I was more focused on them just standing there doing nothing, even when Gulool Ja clearly used cheats, like man put in a game shock, and because that element of the death felt illogical to me, I was more so focused on that element than, say, the implications of what it means for Gulool Ja to have this new soul technology, or get a resurrection and to kill his own father. So for me, it took away from the emotional stakes involved with Gulool Ja's death. However, a death I think they actually handled rather well and pretty okay was Gulool Ja's. We got more character development and character analysis for Gulool Ja there than we we had in all of Dawntrail up to that point, really. Laying all of his insecurities and pretty much his entire story that seemingly happened off-screen, bringing that to light and talking about it, having his son crying over his, like, dying corpse that's been transformed because of all the souls he absorbed. It's a bit undermined because, again, up to that point, I wasn't particularly fond of the writing of Gulool Ja, but that's an element and a moment in Dawntrail that I thought was pretty well handled. And another one, I really like Living Memory. I know there's quite a few people out there that don't, but while it does feel in a lot of ways like a rehash of Ultima Thule, I like the fact that we were actively turning off of these memories. And we had, like, direct stakes involved there with Kryl and Aaronville. And even Otis. It's not perfect, nothing really ever is, but I thought on the whole I really liked how they handled this moment of the story. It's not just the fact that these characters quote-unquote died, even though they had technically died before and we're just killing their memories. Or at least their endless versions. It was also reflected in the zone being turned off sequentially, as we kept moving through it and progressing. Now, having said that, I'm not saying these like perfect uses of character death or anything like that, just elements of character death that happened in Dawntrail that to me are undermined by the rest of the writing of Dawntrail, but on their own, I think are pretty good representations of how to do character death in interesting ways. Because it's not like Final Fantasy XIV doesn't have character death, but I think 14, relatively recently, has aired away from having main characters really die off that aren't antagonists or villains at some point in time. They teased Y'shtola was on like death's door, like knock knock knocking on heaven's door, long time ago, and that hasn't really gone anywhere. And 14 a lot of times has tried to cop out of characters dying and use their quote-unquote death as a fake out, so it feels really good when we see them again. They did this in Ultima Thule, and I know with the Scions there's quite a few people out there that were disappointed that, oh, they just all came back, so this undermines the entire emotional investment we had with Ultima Thule. I always disagreed with that sentiment. I'm glad they didn't all just die in one fell swoop there. I would have felt that was rushed and lazy. And to me, I view Ultima Thule as more like a capstone for all of their individual stories coming to a head in this singular moment, more than anything else. It felt very Persona to me, and if you've played Persona before, you know what I mean when you get like the rank 10 social link / confidants at the end of the game. It felt very similar to that feel. But characters like G'raha Tia in 5.3, where you have this big moment after the Elidibus fight where he turns to crystal and becomes part of the tower, but we find a workaround to bring him back afterwards. Felt really good in that moment, and I'm glad that G'raha Tia is sticking around. A lot of the cases when it comes to these examples I'm going to bring up for Final Fantasy XIV aren't necessarily talking, or at least I'm not talking about how they should have kept these characters dead in these specific circumstances. That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying when you do this enough times, the fear of that sword of Damocles hanging over all these characters starts to lessen and lessen until we operate in an assumption that these characters aren't going to die, which can take away stakes that may very well be needed for emotional investment in the future. Heck, even way back when in Heavensward, they did a fake-out death with Aymeric, where we thought he got stabbed in the street, but it turned out he missed a little bit and he managed to live. But, speaking of Heavensward, I think it's the expansion that handled character death the best. It wasn't overused, but it also wasn't too sparing either. And the deaths that happened greatly enhanced the story being told, and furthered along certain character arcs in development like Estinian, or even the Warrior of Light with Haurchefant. You had Shiva dying, which helped further the story of Estinian. But arguably, my favorite character death is one that's not talked about all too often. That is in the Patches of Heavensward with Ilberd. Again, I know he's a villain, so... But what I really liked about his death is that he ultimately wins. He wanted us to go and liberate Ala Mhigo. He wanted to start this war between Garlemald and the force of Eorzea to liberate his homeland, and he was willing to die in order to be the spark to ignite the fires of war, and ultimately, that's what happens. We go to war with Garlemald, and we free Ala Mhigo. Not to mention, his death is rule of cool to the max. Dude falls off to like summon Shinryu. It's awesome. And I think the voice acting in that scene is also stellar. But like after that moment, most of the time when we have character death, outside a character like maybe Tess Lane, if a character dies, they're either relatively new in the narrative or they're not that major of a character. Like they're not a 1A list of characters. They're not a Y'shtola, they're not a G'raha, they're not a fan cred. They faked his death out a couple of times back in Shadowbringers as well. They're not like one of the twins or anything like that. They either characters that were villains or antagonists at some point in time, or relatively minor characters like, say, Tesseline. She was a character we were introduced to at the very beginning of Shadowbringers, and not too long after does she die. It's a rather gruesome death, and I think it's a really cool moment, but I think there's a valid argument to be made that Final Fantasy XIV very well may need to re-embrace the idea of being willing to kill off major characters. And I don't want it to become Game of Thrones where like everyone dies every other episode or whatever. I think that would cross into the line of overusing it too much. I think having that sword of Damocles over every character creates interest. When we don't know what's going to happen, we end up caring more about a story because we want to find out what happens. But if in the back of my mind, I just assume none of these characters are going to die that I really end up caring about, then I become less invested because I kind of know that no matter what happens, no matter what stake is brought up in front of us, they're gonna make it out okay. Now, I am kind of glad no major character died in Dawntrail because, lol, can you imagine the reaction people would have if, say, Y'shtola died in Dawntrail of all things after Endwalker? It'd be kind of funny, not gonna lie, but I don't think it'd be a good use of that character. But I think going forward, for the future stories to be told, we should at least have that fear that, hey, maybe they're not all gonna make it out of this one. That is if you're gonna really heavily use the Scions or other main characters and not just say, okay, screw it, have the Warrior of Light go off to this new land by himself. We're gonna introduce an entire new cast of characters for this story arc. That's another way you can go about doing it, and have the major characters in that story feel as if they're always on death's door, or as if it could always be around the corner. That unpredictability breeds interest. Like a lot of discussion on the internet of all things, people can resort to extremes way too often, where it's like, hey, we need to go full Game of Thrones, I need everybody to die, I need a character to die every level of this MSQ, or it's trash and just terrible. Or it's like, if you kill my favorite character, then I will burn down your home, bite at the ankles of big business, and tear down the establishment, right? Like, we don't need to go that far to it. But I'm just saying, the threat should exist, because having that threat breeds interesting scenarios, cliffhangers, and emotional intrigue in the story going forward. And if my predictions that the story going forward for Final Fantasy XIV is going to get progressively darker and more personal for the Warrior of Light, progressively so, over expansions, having that grim specter of death would be an extremely important thing to always have in the background. Because it does feel a little cop-outy when I can essentially divide all characters into like one of two segments. The major 1A characters that are unkillable, like your Wuklamot, like your Silence of the Seventh Dawn, the Warrior of Light, obviously that one though. And then you have like everyone else who is like, yeah, but like, F them, you know, they can die. I think a part of me that really does care about this issue for Final Fantasy XIV cares about it because a lot of my favorite moments historically in Final Fantasy XIV have been the result of another character dying. Xenos, Emet-Selch, Ilbud. I even kind of like the Papalymo moment. And I think when character death is utilized interestingly and to great effect, it can be a massive improvement to the story and my investment. But I think over the last few years, 14 has kind of edged towards a story, or at least the feel of a story where it's like, okay, but I don't really need to worry about any of these characters really dying that I care about. Because what they'll probably do is introduce another character that's important to another character and just kill them off. And I don't think that's enough. I think a really cool direction they could go for, say, 8.0 is have the Warrior of Light go on their own journey without the Scions, introduce a whole new cast of main characters for that journey, to reinstill the investment that say, hey, anyone could be on the chopping block here, and maybe have a major character death in that story, and use it to further everyone else. I think that could be a really cool direction to go, especially coming off the back of, say, Dawntrail. But hey, we'll see what happens. I think I've yapped enough for one day, so I'll call it there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. And leave a comment down below with what character death in Final Fantasy XIV hit you the hardest, or was your favorite? I'd love to hear your thoughts and hear your opinions and hear your perspectives. And if you agree with me, or do you want them to stay the course with their current writing style, I'd love to hear your thoughts and hear your opinions and hear your perspectives. Stay safe, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again!